Hello, everyone. I'm glad to welcome you all at this amazing event that concerns such an important and crucial topic for the well-being of our society. I thank you from all my heart for attending our event today. First, to present myself, I am Mihaela. I was born in Moldova. I'm living in Berlin. I'm a student at Martin Luther University. I'm an influencer and an influencer marketing intern. When Nicole and Alex contacted me and invited me to personally to be one of the hosts today of this public panel discussion, I was absolutely delighted to accept it, since the topic is of great importance to me and my country as well. So let's talk about consent. Today is a very important day for the Conversations on Consent campaign. The campaign was started 2 years ago and launched it last year with a 10-year anniversary of the Istanbul Convention against violence towards women. We are hosted by the European Commission, and today we gathered here to discuss the European directive that was released this year to criminalize non-consensual sexual acts across Europe. Our purpose is to discuss and figure out how to encourage a consent culture in Europe. Next, I will give a word to Louise Osborne. She is a freelance multimedia journalist based in Berlin. Originally from the UK, her impressive work focuses on inequality, human rights, migration, and environmental issues around Europe. She is also co-host of a new podcast, Flawed, which delves into European laws created to protect women from violence. So, Louise, the floor is yours.
Okay. Michaela, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to the European Commission for hosting us here today. Welcome everybody, and welcome to everybody who is also watching over the live stream. As Michaela said, I'm Louise Osborne and I'm a journalist. I'm here today to moderate this panel looking at what it means to build a culture of consent. We will have a Q&A at the end, so anybody here who has any questions, please hold your questions and we will go into them with the panel towards the end. Anyone also who would not like to be in any photos, if they could just move to the back of the room, because there will be photos taken throughout the event. Okay, so I am joined by a brilliant panel today. Thank you all for being here. To my left, we have Alexandra Born, who is an activist, entrepreneur, and co-initiator of Conversations on Consent, which is the reason that we're here today. And Alexandra will be talking a little bit about her personal experiences with the issue of consent. Also joining me is Luam Gibrimariam. I hope I got that right, sorry.
Yes, you did.
Who is Senior Campaign Strategist for the petition platform INIT, which was launched this week, so congratulations on that. You support and advise activists looking to make real change, which is fantastic, so thank you for joining us. We also have Charlotte Proudman, who is an award-winning barrister based in the UK and specializes in issues surrounding violence against women and girls, and has been instrumental in changing legal approaches to rape and female genital mutilation. And last but by no means least, we have Nicolaus von Peter, who is here to represent the European Commission and is standing in for Kirsten Leuber, your colleague who unfortunately wasn't able to make it, but was from the Gender Equality Unit. So thank you to our panel, and we will move straight on to it. I just wanted to start with a couple of facts. So, 1 in 3 women in the EU has experienced physical or sexual violence since the age of 15. 1 in 20 women is a survivor of rape. These are assaults where consent was denied to these survivors. Consent is often talked about in the realm of sexual encounters, but it has a much wider meaning than that. You can talk about consent in relationships, for example, consent when you have an examination in a healthcare context, consent when it comes to your data. Everybody's heard of the GDPR, for example. We live in a culture where consent is not always sought, and therefore sexual violence and harassment are rife. How can we change that? Today we're going to be discussing looking at building a culture of consent, which means normalizing asking for consent and respecting bodily autonomy. It's a huge challenge, but there is some effort already being made. In 2011, for example, the Istanbul Convention was adopted by the Council of Europe. It set together a comprehensive standards to be implemented by states to prevent and combat violence against women and domestic violence. For example, making sure that there's a consent-based definition of rape, which is still not the case in most EU states. In March this year, the European Commission proposed EU-wide rules to combat violence against women and domestic violence. They proposed EU legislation for minimum standards, including making sure certain forms of violence are criminalized, such as rape, as defined by consent, cyber-stalking, cyber-harassment, and female genital mutilation. So how can we make all of this a reality? First, I'd like to start with Alexandra, who is going to talk a little bit about experiences she's had where her consent wasn't obtained. So, Alexandra.
Yes, I'm a survivor. I'm a rape survivor. And I experienced several forms and shapes of rape and sexual violence, such as from my ex-boyfriend, deceived me, Tinder swindler style. You all know it now in Netflix, it's a series. So he did that for 5 years. I never consented to the sexual acts because I didn't know that he basically had sexual encounter with other women. He was engaged, by the way. I didn't know that. He never told me. So he never informed me about anything like this. And also by a serial rapist. So I said different forms and shapes because also a serial rapist who raped several women. He's still in custody. And also my other kind of not boyfriend on-off thing, but we had a monogamous agreement. And but he did deceive me, and he also never obtained my consent during sexual acts, and later I found out I wasn't the only one. There were several women he did it to. This is why he left to London after I confronted him about my case and about other cases. So he thought it's easier to leave the European Union going to London, yeah.
I mean, thank you for sharing that with us. Did you try to seek justice in any of the cases that you're talking about?
Yes, I tried to seek justice with a case with a serial rapist. The other women, like not all women he raped, but like some of them, 7, at least tried to seek justice. But raping and tried rape with 7 women, and he admitted more, is not really justice, getting 5 years in prison, and now he has a security detention. So that is not really the justice I'm thinking I really want. Some women can't work because they are not, where they're still traumatized. I have a PTSD. And in the other cases, one is still pending, where the guy left to London, and they told me it takes longer, it's more challenging because he left the EU. And the other one with the deception, there is no legal foundation in Germany to bring justice for his deception for 5 years. So this is why I'm sitting here today.
Okay. When it comes to deception with regards to sexual encounters, it's not something that is dealt with very well by the law. Charlotte, maybe you could actually talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think, as Alex mentioned, the thing that we've all seen is the Tinder swindler on Netflix. Everyone will be familiar with that, and that's, I think, just one example of deception at, one of the most extreme forms of deception as well. But I mean, I've seen cases where women have been what we call catfished It's actually a significant violation in terms of an invasion into somebody's privacy, to who they are, building a relationship based upon a foundation of lies. And as a result of that, often they believe that they're in this secure relationship, can then enter into a sexual relationship, and upon learning about the fact that they have been deceived, feel that they have not had the ability to be able to provide free and full consent, and that opportunity and that right has been taken away from them. And it is a fundamental right. It's a fundamental right to bodily autonomy and to bodily integrity as well. And if you don't know primarily who you're having a sexual relationship with, then it throws into question, as Alex has said, what consent really means. And I know that women have been very significantly impacted by this, including suffering with PTSD as a result, which is, life can be lifelong for some women and girls and can impact as well upon, as Alex mentioned, upon their ability to be able to work and even just go about their day-to-day lives and activities. And the law doesn't fully reflect the complexities and the nuances of consent in an ever-evolving world under the patriarchy, and what it means to be in a relationship based upon a foundation of lies.
I mean, Nicolas, why is the European Commission and the European Union taking an interest in these kinds of issues when dealing with rape, for example?
Because, as you mentioned in the beginning, it's a serious matter, and I think this Commission is particularly true to, and we have proposed a lot of initiatives in the last 2 years which address issues of fundamental rights and which really tackle crucial questions which we consider societal challenges. So for those who believe that the European Union is all about austerity programs and Brexit and many economic issues, I mean, we've proven you wrong over the last 2 years. Honestly, I think these are the tough cookies, because this really, we are now talking about harmonizing member states' criminal law, and this is a very sensitive issue, as you can imagine. And we have a wide array of different approaches throughout member states. We have still member states, 12 of them, for which a rape needs a threat or force. We have member states where there are basically very strict limits to the limitation, statute limitations, where you actually can talk about it, and we have to go to the authority and inform authorities, police, about what happened to you, which is, as you know, a serious limitation to effective remedies, because women will probably not talk about it for months or even years, perhaps. So the statute, I think that's the correct term, no? The criminal lawyer will help me. Statute of limitations?
Yeah, the statute of limitations.
That's really an intricate, an important question, and it differs widely among member states. And so you have some member states where the burden of proof has been shifted on the victim, and in other member states that's precisely prohibited. So it's not an easy thing to tackle. Yet we believe that it's really important, because it's part of a general problem that we see. And you mentioned already the cultural dimension to it, and it's not, I guess, nothing generally European. The patriarchy is not an invention by us, but it's still very much determining the relationship between man and woman. And so if we're really serious about gender equality, we have to really look into it in all the different shapes and forms, the discrimination. And this is a particularly nasty area, but we're not shy to tackle it. And so this question of consent is the core of a wider thing. And so the law we've proposed in March on the International Women's Day is much bigger. It has 52 articles, and there are many issues we probably will touch upon during the discussions, but the consent is really the key question for us as well.
Luam, you actually work on trying to bring these issues to the attention of politicians and people who can make this kind of change. How do you do that? How can you make something like consent the center of a societal conversation, I guess?
I think one thing that was just mentioned is consent is such a complex concept, even for for people like us, I guess, that are trying to educate or to change a law. A lot of times it's so layered and it can change in an instant. It's also, I think, a progressive term with people and identities and so on changing. Consent is so vast. And the way that I've been going about it is trying to work with survivors, people who have personal stories and are kind of willing to take away the power of the predator that did something to them and trying and channeling it into something that will last and possibly protect others from having to experience the same thing. So I have actively supported the upskirting and downblousing law change that happened or that went into effect 2020 in Germany with Hannah Seidel and Ida Maria Sassenberg. And Hannah had experienced upskirting. So one of the, I think, bigger challenges was to actually make politicians see that what was violated wasn't just her privacy by taking upskirting as the practice or the crime of taking pictures of someone's private part without them knowing, and then in worst case scenario also uploading and sharing them on certain platforms. And so the difficulties that we were facing were, one, for sure, that the politicians that we talked to said, well, there are laws that would protect it already. And what they were not getting in the beginning was that what was violated for her was her sexual self-determination. And that what happened, she's now in her 30s, what happened with her when she was 16 affected her sexual relationships, her sexual identity in such a big way that she actually went and said, okay, you know, there is a theory of change, what I like to call a theory of change, was the change of the law in the UK. So if you have a country like the UK and an activist, I can't remember her name right now, who actually experienced it, Gina Martin, there you go, thank you. Gina Martin, who fought and changed the bill in the UK, you actually can go to politicians in Germany and be like, look, there's someone who did it, and we also part, and we ratified the Istanbul Convention. Why are you telling us it's not possible? So it takes a lot of courage and determination for a survivor to consistently and repetitively go to media, which we used particularly in the beginning, to create an agenda that is not there for a lot of people. Upskirting was not a problem because there was no data, and there's no data because it's not a crime. So it's like this vicious cycle. You're trying to prove something that people tell you is not happening because we don't have data. So that was really difficult. But with time and as I said, her courage and determination and the media support, them jumping on that train of our agenda, basically you kind of force politicians to the table, and we decided to go with a state strategy, I guess. We tackled the biggest states in Germany first, and the justice minister at the time, Guido Wolf, in Baden-Württemberg, he invited us for the conversation. And when he was sitting in front of 3 girls that were telling him, like, I think he understood. So he made us believe that we also came with a draft for a law. Actually, we didn't come empty-handed just with signatures. I guess we said, like, look, we worked with lawyers. This could be a potential draft. And yeah, and it went from there. And eventually the Justice Minister, Christine Lambrecht, also invited us. And yeah, you have to endure a lot of rejection on the way to getting a law changed. But it did happen. It's possible. And I'm really hopeful that this will also happen for the petition and initiative started by Alex and Nicole. Yeah.
I mean, Charlotte, actually, you've been working on the new draft definition of what consent would then be. I mean, can you tell us a little bit about that and, you know, talk about the complexity that Luan was talking about, for example?
Yes, I mean, it's a lot more wide-ranging than even what's in law at the moment, for example, in the UK, where force isn't required in order to show that a woman has not consented to sex. So in the sense of saying it's wide-reaching, it's recognising the complexities of the society that we live in and recognising the gender inequality and the imbalances in power within relationships that might be taking place where sex is happening. So looking, for example, at the parties who are having a sexual relationship. So is one person more powerful than the other in terms of it might be social capital, economic capital, cultural capital, other forms of power or privilege that mean that they are able to necessarily encourage or even force in some situations someone to submit or acquiesce into having sexual relations. It also includes, for instance, deception as well as a key factor in looking at whether someone has lied about who they are, their identity, in order to compel someone into that sexual relationship without their free and full consent, knowing exactly what and who they're having a sexual relationship with. And it includes a multitude of different factors, and importantly, the fact that consent can be withdrawn at any time. And it's making that crystal clear. Whilst, of course, we all recognise that as a concept, including supposedly within UK law, though actually how it plays out is often a different matter. You can look at how the law looks in theory, but then you look at how it's implemented in practice when it's handed over to state actors to implement it, including the police, who aren't always necessarily trained in domestic abuse, trauma, how it impacts upon memory, along with the Crown Prosecution Service or other similar actors across the EU. So it's understanding really how consent has evolved, I think, over a significant period of time, and we want to make sure that those that are entering into this sexual relationship are doing so, and it's welcome sex, it's mutual, it's respectful, and it's enjoyable. And that's really what it's about. It's setting a standard and embodying a society that we want to live in, where men and women are equal when they are having sex, whilst also recognising the constraints and the kind of context of power imbalances where that is taking place. So and although I said all of this, it's actually quite short. I promise it's not very long, and it's recognised as well a huge body of work by other scholars that have come before us, like Catherine McKinnon, who was a huge part of this, and looking at how we've defined what consent means. Because, of course, she has been around for decades and working on this, not only in terms of a domestic legislation, but also internationally as well. And so we hope that it will be able to work towards something that we can all aspire to in terms of our own sexual relationships. And we've spoken a lot as well about affirmative consent, the idea that saying yes means yes, that you want to have sex with someone, and recognise actually doing something about it to ascertain the other party's consent. Because all too often the onus is put on a complainant or a victim to explain what she allowed to happen to her body without asking him, well, what steps did you take to make sure that she wanted that, and then it was enjoyable, and then it was mutual, and then it was respectful. So it's about placing the onus and the burden also upon the perpetrator and recognising his role in this, rather than, as you suggested, rendering him invisible and putting the emphasis upon her body, her actions, her words. So I think it's a very powerful, forward-thinking, progressive view of what consent should look like in a modern-day society.
I mean, Nikolaus, you said, obviously, trying to get this across to all of the member states of the EU is a difficult issue. I mean, how can that be done to make sure that there is a consensus on the way that consent is dealt with?
I mean, that's now a matter for the legislator, which, as you know, consists of member states' representatives. I mean, ultimately the ministers in the council and the parliament. So if we propose the law, and as usual, there is a procedure which allows both branches of the authority to examine the proposal in detail. And obviously, I mean, this will be then. I mean, their reading will be influenced by their advisors, by by public, you could call it pressure or information or lobbying, and that's important that not only we are informed while we are elaborating the proposal, because it normally takes not only days and weeks but months or years, and we have a structured process of basically getting input, and then we have internal validation where people look at the proposal and see whether all these steps have been taken and if different options have been weighed. I mean, if we have proposed in their view the right option, looking at the impact on society, on the different factors. But once it's on the table, the real legislation starts, and so it's, if you're interested in debating it, this is an evening where we debate the question of consent, but there are 51 more articles in the proposal which are relevant as well. But the issue of content, that's something, I mean, very often the Commission's proposals are, I mean, they are improved, can happen, no? And they are depending on what the Parliament thinks and Member States. So if you want to be part of the debate, you call your you basically look up who's representing you in Parliament or any other member of Parliament, and you write a letter, you call him, and you try to have a meeting. Sometimes it happens that you can have a meeting in person, or you team up with other organizations. You have a petition, and that's probably now it's very effective because the negotiations have started. Yeah.
I think if I may jump in there, I think in theory, yes, all politicians are elected officials and the door should always be open and whatever the will of the people should be implemented, but that's not reality. Like, I mean, this is my everyday bread. I support a variety of topics that should concern politicians right now, and it's not a topic. And petitions or initiatives, like my experience is that if there is no public pressure, like there was through campaigning, hard campaigning work, lobbyism basically, with media and social media and like this kind of power, there's no reaction. Because for a lot of politicians, consent or sexual consent in this case, or upskirting or femicides in Germany is not on the agenda. Is literally the opposite. Budgets for or against sexual or violence, gender-based violence in general, are going down. This is the data. It's not seen as an issue. Like, and if you spin it even further, there's no budget kind of for education. Like when we start with children, it's like, okay, the law might, we can implement a law tomorrow, but if people don't learn about sexual consent or affirmative consent, as you said, I didn't learn that in school. And how do kids learn today about their sexual identity, about enthusiastic affirmative consent? I don't know. So if it's not happening in school and it might or might not happen online, I think it's going to be difficult just to say, yes, there's an Istanbul Convention. I think that's great, but we also need the budgets in education and so on and so forth to actually make it happen. There needs to be more will, actually, of the elected officials to do that.
But there's a proposal now on the table, so you cannot say that.
Yes, so yeah, I mean...
And actually, as I said, it's quite comprehensive, so we're also including these questions of prevention, education. There are articles which actually tackle gender stereotypes in media, and so there's flanking measures. So I think there's a good basis now for a more focused discussion on this particular question. And I mean, as I said in the beginning, we have these 27 member states with all the different approaches to it. And so it's often despite all these differences, we in the end come to an agreement. And it's not always the lowest common denominator. It can be something which is a solution which is basically being fed by different traditions and experiences. And hopefully it's the case here as well. We already had 2 good proposals on child sexual abuse and on anti-trafficking in the last 2 years, I think, where we managed to come to an agreement in an area which is as sensitive as the one we're talking about today. So I'm quite confident that we're going to have a good discussion.
Okay, I mean, Alexandra, you were instrumental in starting this conversation on consent and this initiative. I mean, why did you guys feel that it needed to be talked about?
So yeah, I initiated it with Nicole Bogot, sitting over there. And yeah, we started it because we felt like we were victims in that situation and then became survivors. So, but there was no law. And Nicole found the article in the Istanbul Convention. So that felt like hope. There is something actually covering, for example, deceptive rape, as Oxford professor Jonathan Herring named it, and he worked also on basically the definition we drafted. So yeah, and this is why we started it, because there was still a lot of motivation to implement a consent culture, and also how Lou said, it's important to put money actually in the education, because the main question for me is, how can children learn about sex and using protection, but why don't they learn before about consent, about sexual consent, because how can they, that makes no sense to me, actually. My son is not learning it, I didn't learn it, so how? So education is key, yeah.
I mean, I guess then the question is, how useful is the law in driving this forward? A question for either Charlotte or Nikolaus.
I think that the law it's a useful tool, but it's not the only solution. Far from it. The law only works as long as society consents to the law as well, consents to obeying the law, complying with the law. And then potentially being held to account as well and going through the legal process and seeing the fact that it does work. And I think one of the challenges here, and I can only speak about the UK, I don't know, I'm sure the situation in the EU is perhaps comparable, though I hope not. Rape has become decriminalised in the UK, as it's often referred to, in that you have 85,000 women that are reportedly raped each year, and yet we're only seeing around 1,000 convictions per year. So decriminalisation means effectively the criminal justice system isn't working. It's a crime which continues to take place ultimately with impunity. So how effective really is the law then in deterring rape from taking place when it's become permissible, acceptable, and in some circumstances even normalised? So, obviously society has a lot to do with the way in which we understand the law and the way in which we relate to it, but the law can also be a very powerful tool as well in changing cultural norms and societal attitudes. And I think the two can very much feed in together, the law and education. But you need the law, I think, as a means of saying that this is the society that we want to live in. And we want this to be reflected in our relationships. And so if we have a very low standard of what rape means, and that, it has to be involving physical force or some form of physical threat, then that is setting a very low mark, isn't it, for what actually enjoyable, meaningful, mutual sex actually is, isn't it? It's very poor, isn't it, in terms of the gender relations that we're having amongst each other in society. And no wonder, relationships and sexual relationships involving violence has become so normalised, when in law that's permissible, acceptable, is not even considered rape. In the UK, marital rape only became a criminal offence in the early 1990s. Before that, there was no such thing as marital rape. A woman was a chattel, she was property for her husband. And in some ways, that hasn't changed to the degree that we see rape continues to be decriminalised. And so we need an effective functioning justice system, but carceral and punishment doesn't necessarily always have the kind of changes that we want to see, I think, in a feminist society in any event, which is why we need education, which is why we need training, which is why we need to break down gendered norms, tropes, stereotypes. And pornography also has a significant role to play, doesn't it, in terms of educating young people about what sexual relationships should look like.
Nikolaus, maybe you can then say something a little bit about the EU directive and how it can push for a culture of consent in Europe.
Yes, and I could keep it short and say we cover everything that you mentioned, which is true,
I'm pleased to hear it.
or just repeat everything. No, but indeed we have, as I said at the beginning, the question we're debating today and the legal provisions are really crucial for the reasons you mentioned. I mean, a law that doesn't reflect that basically doesn't reflect social reality, but has no normative power either. I mean, that's a balance you need to strike. It must be the right law at the right moment, no? And it can be a focal point for discussions and basically a moment where you try to lift the ambition and to up and follow those who are already a bit more enlightened and have more ambition and more experience and so and the European Union that happens all the time because member states are all different and some member states have basically, I mean, it's a bit like a personality, you know. Some people have evolved here and others there, and the good thing about Europe is that you can transfer knowledge, that you can share experiences, that you can see what works in one member state, and where some member states need perhaps a bit of, wouldn't say help, but where they could learn from others. And when it comes to this idea of consent, it's not yet there in all member states, and the quality of consent is not the same, no. And probably our proposal, it may not live up to everything that is already that's in the discourse that you've basically sketched out. Perhaps we managed to get everything in during the discussions, but then once the law has become reality, perhaps in 5 years' time you say it's already outdated. So that's always the risk of law. But it's basically you have a moment where you basically project society, our wishes into the future. No, and at a certain point of time, you realize that society has changed, and you have to redo the law. Yes, and to reply perhaps to your question more precisely, the initiative is one which is more encompassing, and indeed it addresses a lot of different things apart from the law, because the law is not really worth something if victims actually are prevented from using it effectively because they're afraid of going to the police, and after a couple of years, the statute of limitations is basically preventing them from doing it. So that's one of the things which is in the law, in the European law, that we provide for longer periods for the statute of limitations, which makes the provisions more effective. And we have provisions on better reporting on the incidents. We have provided for rules that ask member states to basically make sure that police has the adequate resources, that they're trained, that they also are able to deal with the trauma aspects and the gender aspects, because that's not natural that all police officers have the awareness and the capacities to deal with these particular situations and to treat victims or survivors appropriately. Which is really very important to understand. And one important question which touches upon this idea of consent, I think, is that very often I think survivors are being confronted or being asked about their past experiences, and that the question whether it's a rape or not has been inferred, or the answer has been inferred from that past. So one of the, I think, important provisions in the draft directive is that it's basically, as a general rule, forbidden to ask survivors about their past experiences. That the past sexual conduct is not the base for the question whether it's a rape or not, but it's really the consent at the very moment, the explicit consent. We make sure that member states provide specialized support to victims. And then, as we mentioned before, that there will be prevention campaigns and that should combat gender stereotypes, which include men and boys. That's we're mainly women here, but it's really a matter for men as well, or very much so. And as I mentioned, it's also a matter for the media now that we are trying to fund programs that make sure that the stereotypes are not being reproduced on the media. So that's more or less. I mean, there's more into it, but these are important points that my colleague from Brussels asked me to state.
I wonder if I could just ask one question.
Yeah.
You mentioned not using a woman or complainant's sexual history within a case against her. So, you know, as to whether she had sex with that particular person or anybody else for that matter, it's completely irrelevant as to whether she was raped on a completely different occasion. But I think we've moved from a position of slut shaming to mad shaming. So now we're using women's mental health histories against them and pathologizing them as having personality disorders or histrionic issues, using PTSD against them to suggest they're not reliable witnesses, they don't have reliable memories. And obviously this is just a personification of gaslighting, isn't it? Playing out in our courtrooms. And I wonder if you've thought about how that could be factored in terms of using medical records and counselling notes and so forth against women.
Well, I think that's allowed. That's something we would basically consider relevant. But the important thing for us is the enforcement authority, the police, when questioning, is not basically basing its assumptions on mainly on past sexual conduct.
Okay, I wanted actually to go back to Luam, because obviously we said here that law is useful as a tool then in getting the conversation going and to make changes in society. What else can be done, you know, from the standpoint of campaigns like the one that you are working with Alexandra on, for example?
I think one important thing that I recommend people is always to have an ally in this case, or a team that is actually working on it. Because as I tried to outline earlier, having to repetitively tell your own story is quite traumatizing, even though you might think that you are at the point where you feel strong enough or it's long in the past and you've overcome it. To have to do that in such a public stage and to have to face people who don't believe there's a need to change anything is quite difficult, right? So one is being in a team that works towards this goal, and then maybe finding organizations that working on these topics, finding incredible lawyers also. Like I mentioned earlier, we also had support from the Deutschen Juristinnenbund. This is a German association of female lawyers, and get some counseling there. Just include as many experts, include as many allies, feminist allies, and as was pointed out as well, like mostly women here, right? Like we also need to think about strategies on how can we make males in Germany or in Europe also allies to these causes, right? They don't seem to see the issue because they're not necessarily affected, and there's a lot to do, but it's definitely possible. And I think one of the first steps is really just starting the conversation. Be present and continuously try and create hooks. What I call is create an event out of nowhere. We don't need to wait for another person's rape case to go super public to change a law or to ask for more funding for education or whatever. But like it's not going to be easy. I'm expecting to be in very tight partnership with Alex and Nicole for the next 2 or 3 years. And that's just being realistic. And it doesn't need to be every day full on, but it's more like a marathon, not a sprint, right? I think that's really, changing a law is not going to happen tomorrow. The directive is amazing. And I think we need to have these kind of things on paper to even imagine what's possible. But you also have to be realistic because you get disappointed, right? So, be in there for the long haul, not the short one, I guess. And I guess one thing also that this week particularly was a bit difficult in Germany. I think it was this kids show, Die Sendung mit der Maus. They're trying to change education around sexual identity, different sexual gender identities and sexual orientations and so on. And like huge media outlets are saying like, you know, you're destroying our kids' future. And so these like kind of right-wing ideologies that always pop up when we're talking about feminist issues and particularly about gender-based violence, they always seem to come up in these moments when there is conversations around anything that affects females or minority genders. And so we also need to be clear and in pooling our forces against these kind of rhetorics, basically, these theories that me speaking up about a rape case, or that changing the law towards consent, sexual consent in Germany, would then have all the females in the world claim that they have been raped. When we just heard the data is actually telling us that even if I report my rape, nothing's going to happen. So it's not going to change, and I think we need to be very careful and very strong-headed in keeping these kind of rhetorics out of lawmaking and changes that we try and make.
I mean, Nicolas, you mentioned something with regard to dealing with the media when they're talking about these kinds of cases. I mean, what exactly did you mean by that? How does the directive deal with the media in terms of the way that the media reports on rape cases and things like that?
I'm not sure what the provision actually looks like exactly, but I know that in the directive it has been addressed. Yeah. So basically, that there is a tendency to blame victims, for instance. No? It's, that a certain onus has been laid on. It's a perspective on rape, which is a bit problematic.
I mean, Alexandra, what kind of impact would you say that it has on survivors of rape when they read about cases in newspapers and things? And I mean, obviously, we've just had the Amber Heard, Johnny Depp case with regards to domestic violence, so slightly different. But, there was a lot of negative press about Amber Heard, for example.
It makes me sad and angry to the same time, seeing that victim blaming society, but not surprisingly for me, because the judge from my case victim blamed me, the police victim blamed me. We live in a rape culture, and this is why we're sitting here, because we have the goal to implement a consent culture where everybody is respected and equal, and not women feel like the second gender still. It makes me really unsettling to read that, and I give all my love for all victims who nobody believed. I mean, to be honest, my own mother didn't believe me. So I believe every victim. Doesn't matter what the media says, and if they say otherwise, because if I'm not gonna do it, who else will? I hope a lot of people, but a reality shown, it's not. They're blamed and eaten upon the media and teared apart in media. It feels like the rape, the unconsensual acts, they are still going on and ongoing in society by other people. Yeah.
I mean, Charlotte, maybe you could say a little bit more about the responsibility of the media when it comes to issues of victim blaming and things like that.
I think Alex is right, that every time someone laughed at a TikTok meme of Amber Heard as to whether she cried or not, was participating in the re-traumatization and the abuse, not only of her, but also of every other survivor that was watching that and thinking that could happen to me. And all of those women, especially the women that participated in the mocking, laughing, and using her as titillation for global humiliation, as Johnny Depp promised her, they are at some point likely going to be victims of rape and sexual violence. And how would they feel if other people were mocking and laughing at them? I mean, that's the kind of society I think that we've very sadly ended up living in, where we've seen the Depp and Heard trial become nothing more than a social media circus and frenzy. And the abuse that she suffered in the relationship, and yes, I can say that because that is a fact. It was found by a High Court judge in London in 2020 that he assaulted her on 12 of 14 occasions, and he is a wife beater. That was the whole purpose of the case, as to whether the son could call him that or not, and they categorically found that he most definitely is. And yet what we saw in the US, in contrast, was the public display of a victim being treated like a wounded animal and being tortured in this courtroom process. And the courtroom normalized the abusive behavior, not only normalized it, made it fun, made it engaging. I mean, it's beyond any real words and I think language of being able to kind of really understand the visceral effect that is going to have on other victims and survivors who are less likely to come forward as a result, including women that have contacted me and feel that they are now silenced. I mean, we must remember that the entire case in the US was about one op-ed that Amber Heard wrote in the Washington Post in 2018, where she didn't even name Johnny Depp. And for that, she's having to pay $15 million for 11 words in which she described herself to be a victim of domestic abuse, and so be it, she faces the culture's wrath. In fact, she faces a legal wrath of that as well. And the law has become a tool to continue silencing women and girls from speaking out about abuse. And silence is complicity and it's impunity. And it means that abuse is able to continue taking place without anybody being held accountable because it's happening behind closed doors. And the whole purpose of the initial feminist movement was to make the personal political, to make what happened behind closed doors an issue that we should all care about. And in fact, this has just set us back even further because it means that women will continue to be silenced, not only on social media, not only in newspapers, not only for speaking to family and friends. They can't even describe their own abuse, let alone name their perpetrator, which was completely contrary to the Me Too movement in the first place, back 5 years ago. So we've come in a full circle from where we started. You know, we started in a position where Weinstein and others were using Hollywood like a playground to rape women and get them to sign NDAs so they could get away with it. Everyone knew it was going on. And the whole purpose of Me Too is to say, yes, this happened to me as well, and I'm going to speak up and I'm going to be counted. And then we see ourselves now 5 years later where if women dare to speak out about the abuse, they're going to be wrapped up in defamation trials and potentially rendered bankrupt and then laughed at in the process. That's where we've arrived at.
I mean, so is there any way that we can actually help women to speak out without them having to face this kind of vitriol through social media?
No, I think it's dangerous for women to speak out. In the current climate, you know, after what's happened with this trial, they could end up, I mean, speaking about the US, wrapped up in defamation case, which would cost a significant amount of money. So I think it really is very dangerous to suggest to women that they can speak out about abuse. They do so, but knowing that they'll not only face a cultural wrath, but also a legal court case as well.
I mean, Alexandra, you've been very vocal about what's happened to you, and now, you know, obviously it's being used as part of a social media campaign for the conversations on consent. What has kind of given you that courage to speak out?
Like, I used my anger about the injustice, which is kind of served to me and to a lot, like all survivors in the system I live in. So I channeled the anger in positive energy because otherwise I felt like it would eat me up, like my PTSD was going stronger and I needed to channel this in something positive and good beyond my business. I channeled it first in my business, then I felt like I need more. I need to help people, and actually that motivated me hugely to start the campaign. And I know there are haters. Hate is gonna hate, right? So hugely, yeah. And some people in my family are perpetrators, so they never were interested in the campaign. Of course, they are not, because perpetrators don't like the campaign usually because they could brought to justice. I mean, in Germany, it's like when the law is there, then you can be brought to justice. So they don't need to fear anything now because the law is not there. But if they keep on being perpetrators and we manage to change the law in the jogging run, then yeah, they can be hopefully brought to justice regarding consent. And I hope also that we strengthen the sentences. And also if teenagers commit a crime such as a sexual crime, in my case, a guy tried to rape me with 14, he had to pick up rubbish, and I had to suffer for years until I got a more severe PTSD because a serial rapist found me and didn't obtain consent, obviously, and raped others and me. So yeah, it's a huge motivation, yeah. And the rest I put in Krav Maga.
I mean, there are a lot of people that say by, putting together and redefining consent, it would end up with men being falsely accused. Maybe somebody would like to address that. I don't know if Charlotte is looking.
I mean, if they are falsely accused, they can. Then when we turn the burden of proof onto the person who committed the crime and who did not obtain consent, then yes, the perpetrator can prove that they didn't do anything.
I think I kind of touched on that earlier when I said there is this right-wing theories that if we were to further or protect female that experience violence, that would mean that all the women in the world would just go to court every day and to the police to claim they were raped. Mm-hmm. And I think that is so far from the truth because, as we said earlier, the courage it takes, knowing that in society we're just not there yet to speak up, even if it is to a friend, even if it is to your mom, as Alex said, to go to a police station and to repeat what had happened to you is horrible. One time is horrible, and I think all female I know someone that said no, I'm not going to court, I'm not going to the police. What's the point? That's going to be even worse. So just because our law changes, it's not going to change that all of a sudden there are 5,000 reported rapes in Berlin every day. It's not going to happen. And it's very dangerous rhetoric that is used by particularly male, by particularly fundamentalist Christian groups, incel groups, TERFs, and so on and so forth. I think it's very, very dangerous to fuel that fear by not going for it. Yeah.
Yeah. So the research shows that it's only around 3% of rape claims are actually false. And that's in the Home Office research in the UK and also research that's taken place in the US. That's it. Now, 97% of those that are accused are not in prison, are they? Far from it. It's less than 1% that actually end up in prison. So let's speak about the real question, which is why are rapists continuing to rape and getting away with it? And why is our justice system doing nothing about it? That's the real question. And, I think even allowing airtime to questions about women that falsely lie about rape is feeding into exactly what we're seeing in the Depp and Her case, actually, that apparently she's a liar about domestic abuse, and so he has won as a victim. It's classic Darvo, this reverse an attack and projected actually onto the other person that they are a liar or they have mental health problems. I think one of the things that's really interesting and very dangerous, in fact, is that in the UK and in the US, there is specific guidance for prosecutors on bringing cases against women that lie about rape, so making false accusations about rape. How on earth do you know if any claim is actually false? And there's no specific guidance on a false claim for burglary, robbery or theft or terrorism or murder, but there's a false claim specifically for rape, which shows the kind of moral panic around a gender-based violence crime in that women are persecuted and punished for bringing claims and then apparently told that they are false. And we've seen some horrendous cases that have actually flowed from this guidance, including the Elaine de Freitas case, where it was said that she had made a false complaint of rape in the UK. As a result, a case took place in a UK criminal court, and she took her own life as a result before it was even found whether she had lied about this or not. I mean, there's an awful lot of media attention surrounding this case, and it's quite a complex case, but it goes to show the kind of harm that it can have upon women if having this moral panic played out as if it's actually true, because it does discourage women from coming forward when they're fearful of those types of consequences, that they could be prosecuted. It really is Darvo playbook.
I mean, is there anything that the EU directive says, or the proposals say, about combating this issue, for example? Nikolaus?
Honestly, don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's move on. So, you know, how long does a directive like the one that is being put together at the moment take? You know, when are we likely to see some kind of fruition or fruit from the work that you're working on?
I mean, it needs to be needs to be adopted by the legislator. So this will probably take until next year, I guess mid next year, end of next year. And then there's a transposition deadline, because directives are being addressed to member states. They do not have direct effect. So they have no effects the moment they're adopted, but they need to be transposed by member states. So member states need to implement them. And so they, for example, by changing their criminal law or civil law in cases like the present directive, which is really a legal instrument in the sense of changing member states' codes. And there's a transposition deadline. I don't know which one. I'm not sure how much time we want to give to member states, but this we need to look up. But sometimes it's a year, so it's for member states to implement it. And from that moment on, it would actually become effective. I mean, the moment Germany would transpose it, it would become effective in Germany. So you could probably reckon with effects starting to kick in the end of 2024, early 25. That'd probably be the time horizon.
Okay. And what, you know, pressure is there put on states to actually make these changes? Like, how quickly do they actually have to?
But they have, once the law is adopted, they have a deadline to meet. It can be 1 year or 2 years. I don't know which one was proposed here, because I don't know the proposal in such a detail, but we could easily look it up, and we know that if it's a 1 year implementation deadline or 2 years, and basically that's the time that's given to them to implement it. And from that moment, once it's implemented, it's a law like a national law, like a regular. It would be there would be changes in the criminal law, in the German criminal law, and it would come into effect, and then it would be from that moment on applicable. Yeah. I mean, sometimes it happens that member states do not meet that deadline, or not even sometimes, but regularly in different areas. And it's for the Commission to monitor and to track progress. And ultimately, we have the possibility to start an infringement procedure when it's not implemented or not implemented correctly. But let's hope it won't happen, and that the member states will all do it very quickly and will implement it correctly and in its entirety.
I mean, how optimistic do you feel about having such legislation in place?
I mean, it's difficult for me to say because I'm no longer part of the EU, and you know, thank you for having me here as like an honorary member. I'm so sad about that fact, and you know, I agree the harmonisation of the laws is so important. I'm devastated about the fact that the UK is not part of that conversation, a very significant one. I'm hopeful. I'm always hopeful. We have to be hopeful. And we're having this conversation today, another conversation on consent, with those in the echelons of power that can make the kind of changes that we are we're hoping for the societies, not just in this country, but across the board. So, I think it's definitely possible.
I think milestones and impacts, like impact moments, are always possible. And I feel like having a conversation and having this directive, that's an impact already. When it comes down to member states, in our case here, Germany, adopting and enforcing laws, I'm not too hopeful that it's going to be quick, because we have adopted the Istanbul Convention, and actually I've been working also on a campaign that would make femicides an extra, separate kind of gender-based violence and homicide based on gender, separate criminal offense. It's really difficult, and I think, it's just realistic to say that even if the directive would be adopted, I feel like there would need to be a lot of training as well in the justice system. Even a lot of judges don't even know that the Istanbul Convention is kind of ratified law also in Germany. So we've done not representative, but we've done a survey with different courts, and a lot of the replies where we don't know. So I think there's a lot of background work. It's not going to be enough to have the adopted law, but it's every little piece is important. Every little conversation matters, and every progressive directive also matters. So in that sense, I'm hopeful. For me, it's not necessarily we will need to implement our demands as we put them right now. If we can have significant number of conversations and change some politicians' minds, that would be huge. That would be nice, yeah.
Yeah, and it's all a process. So, we drafted now the definition of consent, sexual consent, and it will be, maybe it's in a year different. Maybe we adapt it towards a different member state who has got a more progressed definition. Then we just adapt it, and then we can kind of doing sharing is caring, and hopefully Europe-wide one day, and then hopefully globally. This would be amazing. So we kind of can be not just one, we can be stronger together. Because, alone I am strong, but together we are a force, so that would be pretty important.
No, I agree. 4 minus the UK.
Yeah.
It's what I wouldn't like to happen is that sometimes what we also see is that really bad cases happen and then things move. And I really don't think that's necessary. And I feel like this can also be a moment for anyone in the European Commission or in the current German government, if they hear about this panel. You don't need to wait for horrible cases to go and happen before you actually make a move on changing a law. And I know there are other fish to fry, but this is also very important. So this could be a reminder,
For example, I attended a demonstration last Sunday with Hannah Seidel, by the way, from Upskirting. And it was about the feminicide, about Zora and Pankow in Berlin, in Germany. So basically, she was 3 times. She was at the police station and said, "I'm afraid that my husband gonna kill me." He was beating her up, violent against her, against the children, 3 times. And the police did nothing. And now she's dead. So as you say, not such thing needs to bloody happen for us to change something Europe-wide and globally. Yeah.
I mean, do you get the impression that politicians and legislators, have these kinds of laws that they put through, it's all accepted, adopted, and put in place, and then they think the work is done? Is that, you said about funding, for example, being an issue.
Somebody asked me 2 weeks ago, we would like to adopt something in the upskirting law. And I said, well, that's... I don't want to say impossible, but I don't think politicians are going to touch the law that they just implemented already again. They will say, this is a good law for the time being, and we're going to readdress this issue in 5 years' time, probably the next government, maybe if you're lucky, right? So I think sometimes you also have to see it in that context, right? It might be one time upskirting, now it's consent. It could be stealthing. It could be other things, right? There are so many issues. I don't think necessarily adopting and changing the same things makes so much sense. Yeah.
When it comes to European law, you probably see, I mean, this is the lawmaking of the European Union has obviously evolved, thanks to all this the influence from member states. I mean, there's a great variety of approaches, not only in the area we talk about today, but we have so many different areas. So there are ideas that have been basically that fertilize the European Commission's thinking, because we are proposing everything, and then you have also cross-fertilization between services. No, you have people come from DG Agriculture, from the Director General, and they want to change their jobs within the Commission, and perhaps they apply for a job in DG Justice, and they work on this issue. And if they're creative, they may come with an approach from agriculture about enforcing laws and making sure that things are actually moving forward. And they try it out in this context. So if you look into our legislation, you will find a lot of flanking measures, precisely to make sure that it's not a legislation which consists of a dry paragraph, which basically states something and provides for a punishment or a sanction or whatever. But there's a whole, I mean, the panoply of measures, a whole setup which makes sure that there's support for making this happen, what we actually want, because the actual provision is just a means to an end. And so in this legislation, we'll also find a platform for member states to work together. You will have a coordination between national authorities. It's this network idea, no? That you have some sort of best practice and of not naming and shaming, but some sort of benchmarking and of getting people into constant dialogue, and because it always helps to get things moving, keep them going, and of the different member states learning from each other and helping each other. So indeed, it's not done with this law. There needs to be, but it's already in the directive, and it's important that we keep these provisions in, and that they're not just letters, but they're being filled with life.
I think what I was also referring to, thank you for that, is more that the urgency needs to be felt by either the European Commission or the member states, that this needs to be, like, I think the pandemic is a great example of how many laws can be passed in a few months, right? Yeah. Is considered a crisis right now. We need to adapt this, and it happens, right? So, but I think it's important for us to understand, like, how can we also make sure that this directive coming from the European Commission is considered as important as other pressing matters that we have, and it's not a competition between these two. What I was referring to is, like, make space for this as well. Like, it's important to have all other things too, yes, but we cannot neglect basically this directive or gender-based violence issues because we think other things are more important. At some point we have to tackle them, and this directive can be the moment for member states in that sense, yeah.
Okay. I would like to now open the floor to some questions. Does anybody have a pressing question that they would like to put to the panel? Nobody? Thank you.
I mean, I'm not a lawyer for starters, so when it was ratified, I think there were different kind of initiatives and to enforce, I guess, the law, or like make it more known. That also included, for example, a hotline that people can now call in Germany if you are experiencing gender-based violence. You get the support that you need, and so on. And a lot of money is also spent on these campaigns. But like what I was saying is, like, even though these laws are in place, a lot of people in the justice system don't know of them. And then the other part is that the actual budget for associations and organizations working with survivors or having safe houses and so on, it has been cut since we ratified it. So, and there has been more pressing issues where money has been allocated to. And so we need to rethink, and politicians need to rethink, what does it actually mean to ratify and adopt any directive coming from the European Commission? Because in theory it's great, right? But what does it actually look like in practice, and how much money are we willing to spend on the protection of, I think it says women and girls, and that's what the directive is called.
I think that the Istanbul Convention is incredibly important because it takes away, I think, some of the language that we all used on this panel is violence against women and girls being very issue-based. And we look at it sort of like it's in a silo or in a vacuum, you know, like consent, in isolation from all of the other issues that are affecting women and girls in a society which is plagued by male violence. You know, for example, public sexual harassment is rife. 97% of women experience that, according to UN Women in the UK. So we need to see these things as joined up together, and the Istanbul Convention makes a very strong case for that, and recognising it and showing, you know, the kind of laws in the society that we need to be able to see and to be able to live in. And part of that is criminalising public sexual harassment, for instance, which is something that the UK government will not sign up to doing. And I think part of that is because of the prevalence of it. And for the UK government to ratify the Istanbul Convention, they've been very clear about the fact that they want an exemption in place so that they don't have to provide migrant women with recourse to public funds. So they're effectively seen as second-class citizens, which means that they are often trapped in abusive relationships. Many of the women that I've represented have been in situations akin to that, where they've been unable to escape because they don't have the financial means to allow them to do so, because they can't go to refuge, they don't have access to housing benefit. They don't have access to housing benefit, a place can't be provided for them. Along with the other intersectional inequalities, of course, that many women, and we haven't spoken about women of colour, as well as migrant women, are also suffering. And they're at the obstacles with language barriers, perceived cultural barriers, some religious barriers as well, and discrimination and racism that they experience through going through the justice system. And all of these are very much structural, institutional. I think it's important when we think about the Istanbul Convention to recognise that they are all interlinked, and we need a full societal response to it as well. I mean, you know, we've spoken a lot as well about criminalisation of a lot of issues. But I mean, one of the things I'd like to see decriminalised is abortion. In the UK, that's still a criminal offence. You still need to have 2 medical doctors that will consent to a woman having an abortion on the basis that it's necessary on physical or mental health grounds. So a woman is pathologised in this way rather than recognising it as a free choice based on agency and autonomy. Period poverty is another example. We need to make sure that sanitary period products are freely available for women and girls and those that need them. You know, 1 in 6 women and girls are struggling to afford access to menstrual hygiene products in the UK. Now, you know, that's a basic need, isn't it? That requires a legal change, though, to be able to bring that about. It's not about criminalising anybody. It's about recognising universal, basic human rights for which women have largely been invisible because laws have predominantly been, you know, written by men and being made for men. Everything that we've spoken about kind of shows, doesn't it, that those in power of making the laws don't recognise the kind of issues and inequalities that we are experiencing on a daily basis, and why would they? And we've spoken a lot about, you know, people in power who are making the laws, policy, MPs, other people in those positions, and yet many of those are perpetrators of domestic abuse and rape. You know, the Women's Equality Party in the UK said that 8% of MPs in the UK have allegations of a range of issues, including sexual harassment, against them. So why would it be in their interest to support the kind of laws that we are advocating for if they're perpetrators of it. There's clearly a conflict of interest and a vested interest to maintain the status quo. And I think we need to look at ourselves, and we need to look at those people in positions of power when we're asking them to bring about the kind of change that we want to see. You've spoken about how change is slow. Well, perhaps it's not surprising it's slow.
Yeah.
I mean, how can we change that, do you think? How can we address...
Well, gender quotas would be one thing, right, for a start, in recognizing that we need women, 50%, and not just white privileged women either. We need women, across the board in our society. We need a society that's reflected where power is held in order to try and work towards eliminating some of the discrimination that's quite clearly taking place when these laws are being made.
And I would say let's treat it like we treat COVID. That would be amazing. This is why we made a podcast about consent and COVID, such as also coercion with Johanna Nelles and consent. So we wanted to show, hey, in COVID times it's possible, but why isn't it possible that a man stands 1.5 meters away from me without COVID?
I think what is so interesting about what Charlotte said is, like I said it earlier, there are theories of change and they're happening even if politicians are not addressing it. It's like you mentioned period poverty. There was a study coming out and there are several campaigns running on period poverty.
Yeah.
And if we're starting today talking about consent, a year from now everybody might be talking about consent. So I'm in that way, I'm hopeful, because even if elected MPs or people in charge don't see it on the agenda, apparently some women in Europe or in this world do, and I think that's a start, and that makes me really hopeful. And it's really real. That's how upskirting got changed, and I mean, I didn't know what upskirting was, and now we're talking about affirmative consent in a law, and that's great. And yes, there are so many more issues, and yeah, money can't fix them all, and a law can't fix them all. But I think they're definitely a beginning. That's important.
Okay. You have another question?
The panel also spoke about police not believing victims and not doing anything. So in which ways could the police change their approach to protect potential victims from getting into serious crimes like femicides or rape before that happens? What could the police do aside from believing potential victims to protect them further?
Who would like to address that? Alex? Okay.
I mean, firstly, they need trainings about racial profiling, because that's a lot of cases happens when they're not taken seriously, because in Germany, they're not white privileged. So, but also, I'm white privileged woman, and I'm not taken seriously. So who's gonna, I think the trainings and more fundings, and the fundings need to be more for shelters, so the police can contact the shelter, but there are not enough shelters because there's not enough money by the state. So this problem needs to be tackled first. The police is just the executive. They just kind of do their job. They need better training, of course, but it needs to be the politicians, the politic laws around it as well. So yeah, you want to say something?
I wanted to add one thing. It's who controls the police?
Yeah.
And that's the question, right? There is no, I know that in Sweden there are separate investigating institutions. If you file a complaint against one particular police person, or if you say I wasn't being treated or taken seriously when filing my complaint about my rape. We don't have that in Germany. So this is a massive issue when it comes down to police violence, when it comes down to people actually reporting crimes against them, be it violence or others. We talked about racially profiling. That goes for when I go into the police station, but that also happens on the streets every day. So I think Germany also has an issue with police, for sure, and there's no will at all to put them in their place, and they need to be put in their place for sure.
Like a naughty dog.
No, I mean, like, yeah, I think we need separate institutions that investigate when I, as a citizen, complain about how I was being treated by police. It shouldn't be that difficult. You know, they are always like, 4I principle. Like, when I send a press release, somebody else will read it before I send it. Yeah, and there's no such thing for police officers. And I also don't believe that all the police officers in the world are bad. But if there are bad people, or people that abuse their power, or that don't take victims seriously, or that actually victimize and use their power to exercise violence against citizens, there should be, there should be consequences. And if my mate that I work with every day is the one investigating me, I think that explains a lot. Also, they can't be fired in Germany, so I think there's we could have a whole separate panel on police and control, who controls the police.
Well, I mean, right, the police are important, right, because they are the ones who are enforcing these laws that we're talking about and the ones that are investigating them, so.
Or not enforcing them, so I don't know if they're that important.
As we say in the UK, who is policing the police, right? That's the question. Yeah. Themselves. Unsurprisingly. And obviously the police force is going to attract a particular type of person into the force. Very powerful, on the streets, fairly unaccountable as well, knowing that your mate's going to be the one that's in charge of any complaint against you. And one of the key issues I think that's facing certainly the police force in the UK is misogyny, which is endemic within the police force. We saw, and I'm sure you're also aware, of the murder and raping of Sarah Everard by a police officer in the Metropolitan Police. And out of that, came numerous reports, found reports of other police officers engaging in misogynistic conduct and behaviour, including sexually assaulting other women, including victims that had gone to the police to report crimes and then had been sexually harassed following that. And that does seem to be something which is cultural and quite rife within the police force, and something that needs to be acknowledged. And I know that there is an inquiry ongoing at the moment in the UK. I'm not sure it'll be far-reaching enough and have the kind of long-term consequences that we need to see in terms of systemic change, but at least it goes some way towards recognising, I suppose, how prevalent this issue is, and being able to look at yourselves in the mirror and see that this is something that we can speak out about, because whistleblowers are often heavily victimized and targeted as a result of putting their head above the parapet and showing what is going on within a particular institution, the police force being the one that we're speaking about now. So I think it's worrying, isn't it? Because when women say to me, should I go to the police and should I report this rape? And, ultimately it's a matter for them, but well, we've seen how re-traumatizing, re-victimizing that can be when you're speaking to somebody who has no training often in sexual violence and trauma responses, and then on top of that might be a perpetrator themselves. That's the reality of the situation. I've been to the police with a friend of mine who had been raped and was treated absolutely appallingly by two female officers who continued to tell her repeatedly that I'm sure she didn't want anything to happen to him, and she just wanted him to, have a telling off and be spoken to. Very clear in their mind that this, of what she had reported, didn't warrant the gravity of imprisonment, let alone a full investigation. And who was she to burden them and use their resources to investigate something as frivolous as a minor sexual transgression? That was the way that she was treated. It's ultimate empathy, isn't it? Why should his life be ruined for a mistake?
Okay.
But what is about her life? It's like always, what is about her life? Like most of the victims from the serial rapist, like half of them who reported him, their they have psychology issues, they have job issues. So who thinks about them? That's always what I think it's important. I could be the one who can't have I could be the same, like not being able to work, or I had that times where I wasn't able to work. So what is about me? What is about my time? How many times do I have a panic attack? How many times do I feel threatened by the guy sitting in front of me in the underground staring at me? Like, we need to think about the victims and not always protecting the bloody perpetrators.
Another question?
Yes, another question. Law is obviously very important, but we also need a culture of consent to prevent all of this. And of course, I want to ask what other actions should be taken in order to educate society in order to prevent all of this, besides, for example, school education.
I mean, I believe, and that goes for consent, that goes for other social issues, just because you're not affected, but somebody is speaking ill of whatever. Let's take the case of Amber Heard and Johnny Depp. I'm not personally affected. I don't know these people, right? But if I would hear a friend talk in a certain manner, I can speak up and say, this is not okay, because other women might not come forward, just to give you a concrete example. So it could it could be, supporting friends or speaking openly about how you date and how you actually exercise consent. It could be sharing a podcast that you heard, right? And not share it just with your girlfriends, but share it with also your male friends that a lot of times are the perpetrators, right? And I think we also not let I think it's difficult because we also let it slide in this boys will be boys and it's just talk. But we also need to acknowledge that what we speak, what we read, what we hear is also speaking things into existence. That also goes for the media, for movies, for everything. So criticize and be vocal about it and share your resources with others as wide as you can.
I think live by your values is so true. You know, if you are a feminist, then live like a feminist. I would say I live pretty much as close as I possibly can to the kind of person that I want to be. I think that's one of the things. So that can include, like, you're talking about films that you watch. For me, it's very important that they are, have strong female leaders in those films, and that you see them and you hear their voices. I'm not just speaking about their relationships either. Literature that you read as well, I think it's an important factor. People that you surround yourselves with as well, like looking at your friendship circles. Actually, are they feminists? Do they believe in equality? Do they want to live in the kind of world that you do? For me, being an advocate for change is a big thing, and my friends from university and the friends that I work with are also strong campaigners and advocates, and kind of, the work that they do is like a vocation. And I think the other thing is also put your head above the parapet. And if somebody says something you don't agree with, I never let one thing slide, no matter how minor it might be. What a minor microaggression, I will still stand up and say something about it. So, for example, I was having some drinks with some friends, men, women, and somehow they got onto the topic. I think it was like a stag do they were talking about how one of them was talking about being a stripper. It was a man, of course, was saying this, and how, what a great job that is, just commodifying the female body and having to do very little for it and maximizing your kind of wage potential. And speaking about it in this kind of very objectifying way. And then, I could see the women felt quite uncomfortable about it. Then also feeling like, I'm here, I want to enjoy my drinks. This is a highly intelligent man who should know better. He's been to university. He also has a master's qualification, and he's in a professional role. And I'm just sort of shocked that these are the views that he's kind of taking. And And then they just all sort of looked at me and were like, okay, Charlotte, go. Off you go, expecting this. And I just looked at him and I just said, what a dick. And, everyone just sort of laughed, and he felt humiliated by that. And I thought, you know what, that's the feeling that you need right now. You need to feel small because you've just treated every woman as if they're this big, and you're mansplaining to them, how they should live their lives and that this is okay to be objectified in this manner. And so it's just things like that, I just think you have to speak out about it. I mean, I can give you sort of many other examples of these microaggressions and how I won't sort of hold my tongue and, and let loose much to my partner's horror at times, especially as most of them is his friends.
Yeah, speaking up is uncomfortable, even especially in your friend circle. It's so easy if you're. That's also something, right? It's so easy to attack people on the internet. But to say what you just said is not okay, and maybe crashing the harmony of a friend circle over and over and over again. Yeah. Change is not comfortable, for sure not. And kudos to every woman, in this case also Charlotte, speaking up.
You have gentlemen's clubs in the EU, but in the UK that's quite a thing, gentlemen's clubs. Where literally only men can be allowed in.
We have no competence for basically regulating gentlemen's clubs. And I mean, obviously they're clubs, but not the classical ones, the ones you have basically on the Pall Mall, for instance, no?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. That's a very British thing. But I mean, there is the same, I wouldn't say that continental Europeans, because in this case I wouldn't say European Union and UK, it's a European thing, no? Because we have,
I have no idea.
No, but the fact that we have
It's very much class-based. That's why I ask. Very much about elitism, privilege, belong to a particular class group. And so in the UK we have, London, these clubs is something that you aspire to become a member of. And there's so many men that are, and so many male MPs and male lawyers where power is held and those really important decisions are being made behind closed doors, and yet we don't have access to them. So women can't become members, but we can serve these men, and we can go along as their partners or their friends, but sit in a separate room, which is more suitable for women, which is kind of even more horrifying, isn't it, that we're segregated in this way. And, I've had friends that have actually gone along to these female friends. I've been horrified by the fact that they would even want to participate in this. And this is an example of living by your values, not going, and also making a point of saying, well, what if that club said no Jewish people are allowed in? What if that club said no people of colour are allowed in? And rightly there would be an outcry, but it's okay to segregate 51% of the population. Why is that permissible?
I mean, we still have a very long way to go when it comes to gender equality, as we all know, really, sitting here. I mean, what would a culture of consent and a world where there was gender equality actually look like? I mean, none of us have lived it, so what would it mean to you? Do you want to go, Alexandra?
So it would be an ongoing conversation. It would be mutual respect, and regardless of gender, regardless of heritage, regardless of, I don't like the word race, or I like to use heritage. I think it's really, racist to say, So, and empathy. So it's empathy and practice, a constant culture. And it's not just about, the person didn't say no or yes. This is a victim-blaming approach, in my opinion. It's about that the person says, am I in a coercive situation? Am I a boss? Am I an MP? So does this intern really want that? Do I bring this intern in a situation where it can't literally decide if they want to sleep with me or not? So, it's about practicing real equality while practicing consent. Yeah.
Do you guys have anything to add to that?
I don't think we need an equal word. I think we need more equitable word, right? Because the systems that have been in place, and like you said, you don't like the word race, but let's face it, there is a power dynamic and race construct that is there. The white people are on the top, black and brown people at the bottom. It's always present. It's intersectional problem. There's a gender power dynamics. There's not equal pay for equal labor. So we would need laws and funding that would put basically people that are in marginalized positions because of these power dynamics, because of these long-standing structures ahead. And of course, the outcry is always there. Oh my God! Now that we're talking about diversity and gender and so on, men are put in a worse position. But it's actually not true, obviously. And there are many studies that have shown that if we just would talk about equality, I don't think we're going to get there in 200 years. I'm not going to experience that. So let's put some money, let's put the money where our mouth is and, advance people faster so we can all experience that in our lifetime, yeah? That would be great.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything that's been said. I think that would be, brilliant, wouldn't it? It'd be the kind of world that we want to live in. The consent revolution is exactly what we need.
Nicolaus, anything to add? Or
Something very simple, which I already hinted at earlier, because I'm just grappling with this. I was in my previous position in Brussels, I was with a commissioner who was very adamant about women's rights. I mean, not rights, but about empowerment, because it was the commissioner for transport, and I worked in a private office, and she was realizing that transport is an area, is a sector where you have basically hardly any women working. And it's not just for lack of interest, but because the sector is just structured, or there's a culture of, there's a very male sector, and it's not and so she tried to change this. I mean, to contribute to changing this, and for her it was totally obvious that the person she would actually put in charge of that project would be a woman. And I mean, I don't understand. I mean, I understand somehow, and I'm not a woman, so I don't know what you've tried, and you probably have had many moments of frustration and a pattern lack of interest on the other side. But what I would actually try is to empower. I mean, to basically ask men to take a bit more responsibility for these topics, and I hope they will. I mean, I've just been here as a replacement for a woman again, a colleague from the Commission, I mean from Brussels. But I would really like to have these panels. That there are more male people on the panel, not for the sake of equality, yeah, because I feel somehow not equal, but because they need to take responsibility and they need to be. And just the fact that equality panels are often staffed with people who are actually the ones who are concerned, somehow gives the impression that they're the only ones who care and they should care, and it stigmatizes or victimizes these people on the stage. So you have to really put the white male there in the middle, and he has to respond to the questions. He has to justify himself. He has to be part of the solution. I mean, there's just one suggestion, but for me it's somehow obvious. Often we have the contrary problem here, no? We have the problem that we have just males sitting here. That's something I don't want either, huh? That we have normally people like me with a tie and a suit, and far too many of them. So we... Yeah.
Well, thank you anyway for taking that role this evening.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you to our panel, to all of you for taking part in this and giving us such a lively chat. Michaela, do you want to take over again? Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much for all your input and opinions. And now the closing remarks will come from the Filia's Chief Executive Founder, Nicole Bogot. So please welcome Nicole Bogot.
Hi, everybody. So I'm very honored to give the closing remarks this evening. This evening to us is very meaningful. As you've already heard from Michaela, who's done a fabulous job in hosting, thank you so much. We've been working on this campaign since 2020, and we've, as Alex already pointed out, we've taken Article 36 of the Istanbul Convention as a guiding star that we could kind of cling onto and start some sort of consent revolution, and to look into what that could mean and to realize that a culture of consent really benefits everyone, everybody, because we all have to live together, after all, however close we want to live together. And to see now that this year, this directive from the European Commission on the 8th of March came out, really is giving us a lot of, even more hope actually, that there's more people than just Alex and I, obviously, and also many fabulous initiatives in Germany that we also want to just highlight. Working on this. So it is a concerted effort that the institutions are taking a look at this, and pushing towards change is very, very meaningful. And also now to work with Lou and the INNE team on this petition that we really encourage everybody to have a look at. It's a concerted effort, and having people like Charlotte also that are so inspiring despite all of the backlash, to continue to put the focus to where it needs to be, always to put the focus back to where it needs to be, and that is a future where we all live together and feel comfortable and practice empathy for each other, and also experience empathy. And I think it's this is something that we want. So a culture of consent is only possible if there are spaces in which we can have these conversations. This is a space that was awarded to us, so we want to just thank you from the bottom of our heart, just that you took the time, your staff, your team, everybody here in the room, everybody who's watching and who will be watching, since this will be available online. Yeah, it's very meaningful, and also thank you so much to Louise, who did a fabulous job. We've worked with Louise before, and her podcast that we really encourage everybody to listen to. It's called Flawed Pod. The information is out there, and yes, we're all scared, but there's no other way just to kind of close our eyes and kind of push forward. So this is all I want to say for the closing remarks. Thank you, everybody. I think we have a little something, Alex, right, to hand over.
Yeah, the flowers.
And they are somewhere.
They're somewhere.
The corner.
Just behind you.
Ah, they're behind me.
They're
Okay,
behind.
so they are not open. So we want to just give this to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And you
Voilà.
can see them now, so we can unwrap them
Many thanks.
together. There we go.
Thank you very much.
So thank you
Very
so
kind.
much.
Dankeschön.
So we can put all the gender roles overboard.
Exactly.
Everybody loves flowers. So thank you, everyone, for coming
Thank
as
you.
well.
So nice.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everybody.